I don't usually talk about the drawbacks to technology, but one of the drawbacks is that we now have information overload. Information literally comes to us from all directions. Fortunately, Microsoft Office helps us manage some of that information. But one of the places we still see a lot of data is Microsoft Excel. As a matter of fact, the new format actually holds 1,000,000 rows of data, and that's an awful lot to try to absorb. What we need to know then are what are the tools, the improved tools as well as the new tools in Excel 2010 that give us the ability to turn that data into useful information. In other words, how do we take all of those numbers and make them make sense, either for ourselves or for those with whom we have to share the information? In this chapter, what we want to do is take a look at some of the enhanced features as well as the brand new features that Excel 2010 has to offer that can help us manage and understand our data.
Excel 2007 introduced a huge leap forward in conditional formatting, taking us from the restrictive kind of border background font choices that we had known for years to an amazing set of visualizations for our data. I just loved it. It was one of the most exciting things along with charting. In Excel 2010, they've improved the icon sets and given us the ability to create conditional formatting with references to a different worksheet in the same workbook. This means that we can customize how the icon set work and how they're applied, as well as no longer needing to spend a lot of time copying or linking our data to the same sheet when we try to use conditional formatting. What I want to do to get you introduced to these features is to take you into the You Got It Budget and Sales Workbook, which I've opened from the Chapter 5 folder in my Project Files folder, and I want to kind of get you introduced first of all to the data. We're going to start with the first 3 tabs. These are all about expenses for the You Got It Training Company. We have a summary sheet that does a regular summary, and then it also lists some averages for each of those. And then for this purpose, we've kind of simplified the data, and we're only looking at 2 locations, Boise and Billington. For each of these, they each have a worksheet for all of the months in 2009 and the actual amount that we spent for each of those months on 8 different categories of expenses, like leases and power and phone and internet and those types of things. So these are formatted exactly the same way. I'm going to go ahead and get us started by looking at the Billington sheet, because what I want to do is I want to apply some conditional formatting. The formatting I'm interested in creating is actually for the expenses that Billington paid for the year of 2009 as they related to wages. And what I would like to do is take a look at that value for each month and see if the amount that Billington paid for wages fell within the parameters that we had for the average that the company was paying. Now, yes, I do know that this is very simple because we only have 2 locations, so it's almost like comparing Billington to Boise. But the concept will be the same, and since I don't want to spend a lot of time just getting you familiar with the data and getting that set up, we're just going to work with these 2 locations in our summary sheet. So we know that in 2007, we got the ability to simply select some cells, come up to conditional formatting, to choose one of the many categories, for example, icon sets. To choose the one that we liked, I'm going to go with the check mark, the exclamation mark, and the X, and simply give it a click. Now that applied it not based on my averages, but based on the data within the same set, so it's comparing itself to itself. And it's also doing some default values by just breaking it down into thirds. The top third is good, the bottom third is bad, and the middle third is kind of mediocre. So that's what we had in 2007, with a few exceptions, but what I'd like to do is click my Undo button to get rid of that, and show you what the new features are in 2010 that you're going to find a little bit more flexible and a lot more usable. The first is going to be the ability to work with different types of icons other than just the predefined sets. So I'm going to start the same way by going to conditional formatting, but then instead of choosing one of these predefined categories, I'm going to go ahead and start with New Rule. When I do this, I get some additional options. Now the top of the window looks the same as it did in 2007. We get into the differences as we begin to move down. I can still format the cells based on any one of these categories, and I'm going to use icon sets. I can still choose an icon style, and I'm going to go with the check mark, the exclamation mark, and the red X. And I still have the option to also show the icon only. But what's changed now is at the bottom of the screen. Before, when I would select an icon set, I was stuck with the icon set. Whatever it had is what I had to use. Now we actually have the ability to customize the icon. Now the first thing I think I need to do is I need to flip this over, because I know that if I'm talking about wage expenses, if it's greater than the average, that's going to be bad, not good. So I'm going to move up and click on the button to reverse icon order. Now I have the red X for anything that's going to be greater than my measured amount. But what I wanted to show you is that we can change the icon. I definitely want the X because that's bad. But what about the middle option and the bottom option? Well, I really don't care too much about the middle option, so I'm actually going to have the ability to click on this arrow, and I could either choose a different icon, or I could say, do not include a cell icon at all. The reason that we want to do that is because most research shows that if you have more than 10% of the values with some kind of a picture on it, people get overwhelmed and the picture loses its value. In this case, we can simply turn off everything in the middle because we don't care about the middle. We're trying to pull out those that exceed the average, and I've also decided I'm going to show things that are good. And that's where the third one comes into play. As I said, before we had to choose from just what was in the set. Not only can I turn an icon off, I also can vary the different images. So instead of using the green check mark, maybe what I would like to do is give them a star. So those are some of the options that we have now with 2010 to vary the icon set or to not show icons at all. Now let's move on to the other part, which is actually figuring out how we're going to calculate which one of these should be used. I'm not going to use percent, even though that's the default, so I'll move to the right, and I'm going to change this to a formula. And since I'm here, I kind of like to do them all at once, not that you have to, it's just my personal preference. So I'm going to get a red X when the value is greater than or equal to, and now I need to define the value. This is where we get into our second enhancement. I don't have to choose this value from this worksheet. So I'm going to roll this up, get it out of the way. I'm going to move down and click on the tab for my expense summary worksheet. And I'm going to click the cell that has the average wages, which happens to be B19. Now, before I get too carried away expanding this out and thinking that I can finish up, I actually want to do something a little bit more with this value. I don't need people to meet the exact average. I'm going to give them a 5% leeway. So I need to take this value times 1.05. Now I can roll it back down, and now we can see that they're going to get the red X if they have exceeded the average wage by 5%. Now what about the second one? Well, the second one is not going to show any icon at all, so let me think for a second. What is my criteria for Billington being okay with their wage expenses? Well, I'm thinking if they hit somewhere between 5% above the average, which we've already defined, down to 20% below the average, then they're doing okay. So we'll do this pretty much the same way. We'll roll it up, expense summary, cell B19, except this time we want to make our calculation times 0.8. Roll it back down just so we can take a look. And of course, our last value is already set for us. If it doesn't match the first one, it doesn't match the second one, that means they'll get a star. So any one of the months where Billington had wages that were below 80% of the average, they'll get a star. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Ta-da! Now we can actually see the results of the wonderful enhanced 2010 conditional formatting feature. And it seems to have worked just as we planned. Let's take a look and see if we can tell how it's working. Let's start off with our first value. When we look at January, it has a nice gold star. We might be tempted to say, well, that's just because this is the lowest value in that entire row, so obviously that should be a star. But remember, that's not exactly accurate. One of the other features that we also used that is new to 2010 is the ability to use cross-sheet referencing. So while this value is lower than all of the others in the row, it's not the value itself that's giving it the star. It's because it's less than 80% of the average wage expense that we calculated back on the expense summary sheet. That's what's making it display the way that it is. We can also see similar results for our other cells. For example, if we go right next door, over to February, we can see that this one does not have an icon, because that's kind of hit our safe zone. It's not too high or not too low. If we move on over and take a look at April, we can see that this one gets the dreaded red X, because it's more than 5% above our average. I know that sometimes when we get into these more complicated types of conditions, and this one isn't too bad, but it's getting there, that's when it gets more challenging to see if they are actually working the way that we intended. If you're not sure, you should take the time to check and be sure. But in this case, our numbers are formatted exactly as we wanted. And this actually is going to simplify things overall because we can now easily glance at this data and know how it relates to other data in the workbook without having to know what that other data is or go look it up as well. We do have quite a few icons here, and remember kind of that 10% rule. But then again, if you want a visual and it just happens to fall onto a lot of your values, that's okay. Just try not to get icon overload. In other words, I probably wouldn't want to put icons on every one of these entries because there's about 94 of them on this particular worksheet. So be a little cognizant of that. By the way, just a couple more things I wanted to mention. In 2007, if you had conditional formatting for a range and one or more of those items resulted in a calculation error, that meant the entire thing basically stopped working. In 2010, they fixed that, and now conditional formatting will actually ignore any errors and continue applying the conditional format to all of the other cells in the range. That's a good thing. Also, the performance is better in 2010 because dependency of the formulas for conditional formatting are actually stored, and so they don't need to be reevaluated as often, and all the formatting is cached too. So if you scroll off the screen or you move to another worksheet, when you come back, the formatting will display a lot faster than it did. So a few things that you can see here are really obvious, including being able to break apart our icon sets and to use cross-sheet conditional formatting, but also some things behind the scenes that are just going to improve the performance that I think you'll appreciate.